Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 26. Body of Water. Ruccharieu lay perfectly still on a mat on the earthen floor. To his right was a simple bed, upon which his sisters slept. He saw calloused feet peeking out beyond the bed, where Aiden also slept on the floor. Moonlight peeked in through the window. Long ago, Ruccharieu had grown accustomed to the faint sounds of his sisters and brother sleeping. Their noises were reassuring. He alternated between trying to meditate and focusing on them, but the ruckus outside was too great. The others were too exhausted to be roused by those distractions. He felt slightly envious, but realized they might not be getting a good night's rest. Equipped with just a rucksack and a room blanket of old clothing stitched together, Ruccharieu considered his options. He'd read through Saba's notes for several hours already and could always continue studying them further. He also knew if he didn't meditate soon, his entire sense of balance and concentration would be thrown off the next day. Ruccharieu rolled up the inn's blanket and whispered some arcane words. His create water spell soaked every fiber. He resumed lying down, his head now resting on his makeshift pillow. The wet fabric pressed against his pointed ears. The shifting water and moisture drowned out enough of the outside noises. The sounds of the water reminded Ruccharieu of being submerged in the river back home. The droplets ebbed and flowed in harmony with the blood flowing through his ears. The thought of the encapsulating pressure in the cool, clear water teased his mind. Closing his eyes, he meditated. His body and consciousness floated in the dark. He imagined dew forming on his face each time he surfaced from the water. His elven ears remained below the water level as he drew air, and he heard a voice from the water's depths. Someone, a man perhaps, was saying something he couldn't discern. His consciousness reminded him sound traveled differently through the water. His meditation didn't feel quite like a dream, but it didn't feel artificial either.
"You're getting stronger, my bulwark,"
the man's voice called from the water below. Ruccharieu now heard this clearly. The voice was mellifluous, and he felt his body tense. Along the dark water, small ripples cascaded outward with scintillating light. If he could only roll to the side, he'd see the shimmering colors up close. If he could roll over completely, maybe he could match a face to the voice.
"I want to go beneath the water,"
Ruccharieu told his body. He felt twitching sensations as small waves tipped his prone body port, then starboard to center. The waves would capsize him if they were stronger.
"I'd like that very much,"
replied the voice. Now he could recall it. Ruccharieu had heard it when he'd let himself rest on the soft moss shortly after they'd all arrived here. This voice, this man, had told him about a vast realm beneath the water.
"Where is this place? I want to see you."
Water splashed against his body's closed lips as his consciousness tried in vain to turn him over.
"We've never been closer. You'll find me where the land ends. That's where the ocean begins."
The voice was smooth and steady. Ruccharieu had only ever read about oceans, but understood it to be something immeasurably large, deeper than the pond and the river at home. He'd feel that pressure he loved so much, water holding him tightly and activating all his muscles.
"What's your name?"
his consciousness asked. His body was still again, and his arms were stretched across the water's surface, embracing its immensity.
"I am Oxbow,"
replied the voice.
"Let's meet again soon, Rook."
His body heaved at the sound of his nickname, which felt intimate as it reached his ears. The water lifted him up, then fell away, and he was falling as waves welled up around him. They were about to break on top of him. Their cresting white water refracted light with brilliant colors against the darkness. Then the waves crashed down on him. Ruccharieu opened his eyes, faintly seeing the plain texture of the stone ceiling in moonlight. He was soaking wet. He lifted his head from the rolled blanket, which was now mostly dry. At first, he thought perhaps he'd overheated, or maybe he'd broken a fever. But this wasn't sweat. He was covered in droplets of pure water. He also noticed he was aroused. Feeling self-conscious, he glanced over to ensure his siblings were still asleep. Ruccharieu dropped his head back down and closed his eyes. Covering his face with his hands, he began laughing silently as a wave of catharsis made him feel the best he'd ever felt in his life. Chapter 27. Room Service.
I scared the wits out of the innkeeper.
Niwa said, returning to the room.
I didn't mean to. She was setting up breakfast and hadn't seen me. I didn't know where to put our soup bowl, and when I set it down behind her, the spoon slipped in and made a noise. She jumped. I was afraid she was going to fall.
Did she spill the breakfast?
Ruccharieu asked, glancing at Niwa's empty hands. He'd recovered from his tantalizing meditation, and his body was dry and at ease once again.
She's fine, Rook. Thanks for asking.
Niwa wanted to sound stern, but struggled not to chuckle at her own humor.
Oh, I didn't mean I expected you to bring food back for all of us. I should probably get up and circulate. Does anyone want breakfast?
Ruccharieu closed Saba's journal and stretched. He had been reading for hours after meditating, long before his siblings had awoken.
Niwa, did you already eat?
Aiden asked.
No, I got out of there right away.
Niwa glanced at the closed door behind her, lowering her voice.
Other guests showed up. I bet they were eager to eat. She set down some food and suddenly there were some creepy guys right next to us. They grabbed a lot of food too. I got nervous.
What creepy guys?
Aiden stood, feeling protective of his sister.
Aiden, they were guests here.
Niwa said.
They looked and smelled dirty though. I'll just wait until they've left. You can come with me if it'll make you feel better.
Don't mind if I do.
Aiden smiled.
If you really want to scare the woman, wait until she sees the mess you made on the wall.
Rook said he'd help me clean that up.
Niwa said, embarrassed. While practicing last night, she had accidentally covered part of the wall with a web spell. Gorham's notes neglected to mention how to undo the magic. She saw Ruccharieu give her a reassuring glance.
Do they have bread out there today?
Aiden exited the room with Niwa.
I didn't see any.
Niwa said. The door closed behind her, followed by the sound of Aiden groaning. Ruccharieu decided to stay with Clyde in the room. His sister was lying on the bed, facing the window. He assumed she was listening to people outside and that she had something on her mind.
I'm sure those guests weren't that creepy,
Ruccharieu said, opening Saba's journal again.
It sounds like the innkeeper was scared of a noise, but not by her own clientele. They'll be fine.
Clyde didn't turn around.
Rook, did you find anything about how we were adopted?
Ruccharieu's eyes widened.
Not exactly. I didn't know what I expected to find at first. Gorham and Saba used to live here, on this world somewhere. She referred to a dwarven outpost several times. Gorham had built a camera obscura there as well, but he must have used a different component because Ulysse hadn't been born yet. Do you think he knew of another blind girl here?
Clyde stared at her brother. She blinked, knowing he tended to venture off topic. She'd wait.
Oh,
Ruccharieu sat upright.
Saba wrote about meeting Aiden once they'd arrived at our home world. According to her, Aiden had found them. Do you suppose a human child walked up to Gorham and Saba and asked, "Can I be your son?" What else could that mean?
I don't know.
Clyde said, glancing at the door. Had Aiden been their first child? He'd been a teenager already when she'd arrived.
That can't be how each of us joined the family, can it?
Ruccharieu rubbed his neck, feeling uncertain. Clyde shook her head. She thought to show her brother the note, but decided to wait. Aiden threw the door open, carrying rice balls on a small board.
These are delicious. They're sweetened with coconut milk. I would have never thought of that. You've got to try these.
Niwa followed behind, carrying fruit.
The best ones were gone by the time we got there. These are a bit overripe. Breakfast here is no joke, that's for sure.
Ruccharieu waited until the door closed before speaking.
Any sinister guests this time?
No, but you should have seen Aiden reaching past the innkeeper to get those. He towers over her, but I'm the one who scared her with a noisy spoon.
Niwa handed out fruit.
I tried to pay for another night here.
Aiden said.
She looked at me and said, bah. Then she walked away. What does bah mean? She had no interest.
Maybe it means we overpaid.
Ruccharieu said.
Or maybe she's not the innkeeper after all. Did we give gemstones to the cook and then commandeer this room? Oh wow, these are delicious.
I can see you're deeply concerned.
Niwa said.
You have some rice on your cheek.
I think this whole town is strange.
Aiden said.
We should start looking for Professor Gorham and Miss Saba soon. But I'm only mentioning dwarves when asking around. I don't want people here learning our names or theirs.
They're listening outside right now.
Clyde said, looking towards the window.
Who is?
Aiden looked horrified.
Nobody.
Clyde heard her brother scoff without turning around. She concealed a smile.
We should go out in shifts.
Ruccharieu said.
Someone should stay in the room with our stuff. I wonder how long we're allowed to stay. But it would be unfortunate if we returned later and there were no rooms available. I still don't understand how that process works here.
I don't want us splitting up.
Aiden dropped Ruccharieu's rucksack on top of some papers.
Saba wrote about all sorts of things, secret things like one writes in a journal. She might have mentioned where they were going. I think searching right here is as important as searching around this town.
Ruccharieu collected the papers.
Do you want to read spells and journal entries all day?
Aiden asked.
Holler through the window if you need me.
Ruccharieu licked a finger and turned the page. Chapter 28. 100 Crowns.
Forbearance empowers us with self-control.
Someone said outside the room window, trying to add bass to their voice.
Don't even think about using any magic other than arcana.
Niwa?
Ruccharieu stopped reading to listen more closely. The sound of his sister laughing outside was unmistakable.
I have no idea what she's talking about.
Aiden said, entering the room. He'd slept through the lecture she was referencing.
That didn't take long.
Ruccharieu said, wondering if he had lost track of time.
Not much to see here. We were talking about moving on while there's still plenty of daylight. I'll explain outside.
Aiden put on his rucksack and grabbed Niwa and Clyde's belongings.
Let me just take care of that. I'll be right out.
Ruccharieu used his burnish spell to gradually remove the mess of Niwa's web on the wall. He wanted to leave the room in the same clean, austere condition in which they found it.
Where did everyone go?
Ruccharieu met Niwa and Aiden outside, surprised to find yesterday's crowd missing.
Most are gathered further up this road.
Niwa said, irritated.
They're all just standing around. Is that what people do here?
We didn't see any dwarves. The townspeople here don't look too helpful. That's the excuse I'm using because I don't want to talk to them.
Aiden was still holding a bag.
Where's Clyde?
Niwa was startled.
She was right next to me. How did she disappear so quickly?
The road ran in a large loop around the town. While Raven's Cross was geographically remote, Silk Rhode felt downright isolated. Already dismayed, Niwa had seen the dirt road as a metaphor for a dead-end town.
Let's go,
Aiden said, looking around nervously. The brightness of the morning sun dazzled him, feeling great despite the lingering odors of dirt and smoke in the air.
Is that her over there?
Ruccharieu pointed to a distant figure running towards them. The siblings hurried ahead.
We have to get out of here.
Clyde said, meeting them along the road. She appeared distraught. Often she avoided eye contact when talking, but now she fixated on some point in space while looking traumatized.
Works for me.
Aiden, relieved, tried to sound supportive.
Clyde, what happened?
Niwa had never seen this behavior, save for when Clyde had broken down outside their altered homestead. Perhaps this new world was going to be one moment of despair after another.
They're selling chained people outside. My people.
Clyde was shaking. She clenched her teeth shut.
Do you mean there are Tikas here and they're enslaved?
Ruccharieu wasn't sure he understood correctly. He was familiar with the concept of slavery, but had never knowingly seen an enslaved person before. Still, he regretted asking the question so bluntly. He might have just said something completely insensitive in response to his sister's anguish.
What?
Aiden exclaimed. He reached for his sister's furry gray hand.
Let's go take care of this right now.
Energized, he wanted to administer some justice, but he realized he had no idea where justice was needed. Then they heard somebody yelling enthusiastically further down the strip. He hurried toward the commotion. To everyone's surprise, Clyde followed closely behind Aiden, almost shrinking by his side. Lowering her head, she gently pulled her hand from his grasp.
We could leave instead,
Ruccharieu said softly. He could see her apprehension, and his sister's comfort concerned him more than his brother's zeal.
I might.
Clyde responded, her eyes scanning the road. They didn't need to walk far. The siblings turned the corner to see a dirt clearing in which a small crowd had gathered. Beyond the crowd, standing on a small platform, was a Tikas fitted with a leather collar and a chain held by a surprisingly large human woman.
Best of luck with that one, my lovely.
A middle-aged gnome said to a smiling woman who was walking past him. She was tugging on the leash of a large pig who didn't look at all eager to follow her.
This wasn't here earlier.
Niwa said to Ruccharieu.
We only saw people standing around. They must have been waiting for this event, whatever's happening here.
Assorted chatter came from the gathered crowd. Everyone was looking at the leashed Tikas woman in handcuffs, her face displaying abject misery and defeat. Niwa asked her sister,
Are you sure that's a Tikas? I mean, she's so big.
The woman was nearly as tall as their brothers and twice the size of her sister or herself. Clyde noticed the woman was barefoot, as she was, and supposed an enslaved person wouldn't have shoes.
Yes.
She replied simply.
Oh, and her poor ear.
Niwa noticed the Tikas woman's right ear had been sliced off and was now scarred over. Clyde didn't respond, and she felt contrite for gawking out loud. The auctioneer began to speak.
And here we have a real bargain. This one's great for housework. Even though it doesn't have a great back, it's going to have pups in a few days. You'll get a bunch of workers for the price of one. Let's start the bidding at 5 crowns.
Ruccharieu and Niwa looked at each other in horror. A person in bondage was standing before them, being marketed as a chore and baby machine, as if this were normal. Although the Tikas woman looked different than their sister, she was probably only a few years older than any of the siblings.
5.
Someone called from the crowd. Clyde felt physically weak. The larger Tikas happened to raise her head and look beyond the crowd. Her eyes connected with Clyde instantly, but they were vacant, almost looking right through her.
6.
Aiden yelled. A few people turned to notice the young human. A few murmured, but then they faced forward again. Clyde somehow found the strength to avoid collapsing, and was thankful she'd not bring more attention to herself.
What are you doing?
Niwa asked in a hushed screech. For the first time in her life, she considered running away from her brother and maybe pretending she'd never witnessed any of this.
10.
The same man who'd started the bidding surged ahead. He didn't turn back at his competition but leered at the woman in chains.
100.
Aiden countered. He'd seen that lascivious glint in the man's eye. Now everyone turned to look at the young strangers. Never had they felt this kind of attention before. It was the opposite outcome Gorm had hoped for his children, and it had occurred on their first excursion into town without him, no less.
Son, do you even have 100 crowns?
The auctioneer called to Aiden, irritated.
His father wouldn't like you talking to a noble that way.
Ruccharieu's face was flushed. He'd never even heard of crowns before today, and now they were on the hook for what was surely a large sum. But when the gnome had called his brother's bluff, the elf had thought to counter-bluff, paraphrasing a line from one of his favorite novels. Aiden looked stern and didn't react to his brother's comment. He was too busy disliking the auctioneer with the big mouth who'd called him son. He held up the pouch of gemstones, raising an eyebrow. The pouch looked quite full, but it was mostly filled with hazelnuts. The gnome looked surprised. He reverted to his salesman's voice.
Sold to the young man in the back for 100 crowns.
The crowd's murmuring grew louder, even though some spectators dispersed. No more chained people or animals were waiting in the wings, so the auction was likely over. Aiden bolted to the human woman holding the Tikas woman's leash, startling them both. He snatched the leash from her, which she yielded with no hesitation. Clyde ran to keep pace with Aiden. From the moment they'd stepped into daylight, she'd not left his side. She'd been watching her brother so closely she hadn't noticed the eyes watching her. The Tikas woman was observing Clyde. Her gaze, showing resignation and sadness, now included curiosity.
Remove the collar.
Aiden commanded the human woman, who was slightly taller than him. His own forcefulness surprised him, but he managed to hold his conviction.
Who do you think you are?
The gnome auctioneer scoffed, looking up at Aiden.
Do it.
Aiden put his hand on his short sword's hilt and leaned into the auctioneer's face. The gnome recoiled, then gestured for the Tikas woman to hop off the platform. She did, landing on the other side of the gnome, possibly to create some distance from her hostile new owner. The assistant was removing the woman's collar when the auctioneer beckoned for her to bend so he could whisper something to her. She complied, then paused before nodding.
Let's go.
Aiden barked. He was holding the pouch of gemstones and hazelnuts. The auctioneer spun around and reached for the pouch, but his irate customer held the bag just out of reach. This made him scoff again, but from his vest pocket, he fished the key to the handcuffs, tentatively accepting the pouch. When the assistant and the auctioneer stepped aside, the enslaved woman looked down at the ground. She was terrified, but hustled over to stand next to Clyde, who shivered when the woman held her hand. Clyde didn't like being touched, but the feel of another Tikis hand had activated some primordial part of her brain. Despite the trauma they were experiencing, holding hands felt safe. Niwa and Ruccharieu were studying their brother, desperate to make sense of why he'd just committed such a heinous act.
Aiden, what in the world did you just do?
Ruccharieu was so astonished, he almost ran out of breath asking the question.
Which world?
Aiden replied, before finally meeting his brother's eyes with a look of pure grief.
We need to get out of here.
Niwa said. The auctioneer had just opened the pouch.
I'll carry you.
Aiden said to the Tikis woman. She froze. He crouched, extending an arm behind her legs and scooping her up. He met little resistance.
We're going to flee.
Leading his family, the human made for the dirty stockade at the town's entrance. A few guards were starting to mobilize, but Clyde had pointed Aiden around some buildings, which greatly helped their escape. Through the lingering odor of smoke, the siblings all stayed close as Aiden carried the woman out of Silk Rhode. Chapter 29. Person of Interest. They hadn't traveled very far before Aiden's new ward found the courage to speak up.
Where are you taking me?
The Tikis woman asked. Her shaky voice was deeper than Aiden had expected. He was surprised to hear her speak at all. Aiden stopped, looking to his siblings, then back to the path. No one seemed to be in pursuit. He took a breath, then set the woman down gently.
I wanted to rescue you. You're free now.
He told the Tikis woman, who looked stunned.
I think you meant this to be a rescue, but what are we supposed to do now? They're just going to auction more people, perpetuating this slavery.
Ruccharieu informed his brother.
But Clyde was so upset.
Aiden's face reddened.
It was the right thing to do.
So you bought her?
Niwa said, incredulous.
I didn't give them money.
Aiden said.
That was the hazelnuts with a few gems left.
I know that.
Niwa didn't know what to say.
It's over now. Let's just figure out what to do next.
Ruccharieu didn't want Aiden to feel cornered. They stayed silent, catching their breaths, although Niwa's tiny huffs sounded the loudest. The rescued woman hunched to take some stress off her back. When relief didn't come, she sat down in the dirt.
Zlam.
Said Clyde. None of her siblings understood the word.
Slom.
The woman replied nervously. She was shocked to hear the conventional greeting of her people. She then thought this small one was also a Tikis, despite a few dramatic physical differences. She'd suspected it the instant they stood close together. All Tikis produced special scents other Tikis can recognize immediately. She smelled the juvenile male, but this Tikis had oddly smooth features resembling a human's more than a rodent's.
My name is Clyde. You're safe.
The smaller Tikis replied, trying to stifle her emotions. The larger Tikis looked at the ground, avoiding eye contact. Niwa had been studying Aiden. She wanted him to confirm he was sincere. She was also eager to give him the benefit of the doubt.
My name is Niwa. It's a pleasure to meet you, although it's not the best situation, I'll admit. What's your name?
My name?
The woman finally looked up.
Yes, you're...
Niwa began, but then she considered her response.
What do they call you?
A516.
She replied. Aiden and Niwa, startled, turned to face each other as if to ensure they'd heard correctly. Ruccharieu furrowed his brow.
Is that a special nomenclature? Maybe a code they use to identify the Tikis?
He caught himself before uttering the word slave.
Special what?
The woman was still finding it difficult to look up.
Your name is a number?
Aiden asked.
Less hostile, please.
Niwa said.
Introduce yourself first, like a gentleman.
Oh, my name is Aiden. I would have fought them off, but it was too risky. I don't want you to think I buy slaves. No one should be a slave, I mean.
The human felt awkward trying to articulate his intentions. In his heart, his actions had been simply instinct, which required no explanation.
A516, I'm happy to meet you. My name is Ruccharieu, but my brother and sisters call me Rook.
The mage wanted her to feel at ease if that were possible. He also wanted to redirect the conversation away from his brother's use of that toxic word.
We'd be happy to travel with you somewhere safe if there's a place you'd like to go. We're definitely not staying in Silk Rhode.
There's nowhere. For me, nowhere.
The woman responded.
You mean you're from Silk Rhode?
Niwa had assumed the woman had been kidnapped. The siblings hadn't yet considered there might not be a safe place to repatriate her.
Niwa, these questions are stressful. She can just travel with us for now.
Ruccharieu felt desperate to maintain an air of calmness.
Are you hungry or thirsty? Can I get you anything?
The freed Tikas had been unprepared for this kindness. She met the elf's eyes for a split second, then collapsed into sobs. Ruccharieu retrieved from the food bag a pouch of dried fruit. He was getting frustrated, searching for a container to put water in, when his hand connected with something hard in the bag. Opening the bag fully, he found 4 stacked wooden bowls. He retrieved them and looked at Clyde.
No, that was me.
Niwa explained with a chuckle, realizing her brother believed Clyde had swiped them somewhere along the way.
Easy would have wanted us to have this from his roadhouse. I probably would have broken his dishes by now if he brought those instead.
Brilliant.
Ruccharieu thought how something as simple as a food bowl was yet another comfort they'd taken for granted at home. Setting down the bowls, he cast Create Water. After filling the bowls, he raised his hands high and allowed the water to flow over his raised head and open mouth. He felt invigorated. Aiden looked questioningly at his brother. Then he distributed the water. After a rough few days, they'd become dehydrated without realizing it. The Tikas woman stared at this magic water for only a second before finishing her serving, looking relieved.
Where would you like your children to be born?
Clyde asked. Her guest dropped her bowl in surprise.
What?
Aiden said. The woman looked at Clyde thoughtfully for a moment.
There are great mangrove trees far to the southeast, surrounding the small islands past the mainland, but that's much too far away.
Mangrove trees? Those sound exotic.
Niwa expressed support through smiles and enthusiasm.
And what are those small islands called?
Clyde asked. The expectant mother paused, then said,
I don't know what they call them.
Ruccharieu thought he understood.
What do the Tikas call the islands?
Her face eased into a wan smile.
Mitra.
I would like to call you Mitra.
As Clyde said this, she was looking back up the slope.
So I have been named.
Mitra closed her eyes and took a deep, cleansing breath.
Incoming.
Clyde's tireless perception proved invaluable once again. She dropped the empty bowl and reached for her dagger. The spiraling path from Silk Rhode was clear, but a trio of brawny humans were charging down the slope. They were running, and sometimes sliding down the mesa. Aiden had instinctively moved to defend the Tikas woman, drawing his sword. Mitra gasped. This angry human was towering over her, terrifying her once more. She involuntarily groaned, trying not to faint. Clyde crouched, bracing to intercept these large men hustling down the steep slope without stumbling. She anticipated they'd not be as adept at fighting on this fairly narrow trail. One man attempted to grapple with Clyde as he reached the landing. She thrust her dagger deep into his inner thigh. Before any blood could escape, Clyde had ducked beneath his legs. The man tripped forward in agony, the dagger still embedded near his groin. He violently tumbled over the road and down the slope, where some coarse scrub bushes finally halted his fall. Another human approached. Ruccharieu spoke some arcane words as he, too, crouched low. This attacker ran forward with his sword raised over his head. Before his attacker could strike, Ruccharieu sprang up, grabbing the man's midsection. Using the man's own weight and momentum, the elf lifted him overhead just as he released his torrent spell. A blasting force of the water sent the stunned assailant high into the air, only to brutally drop him far downhill with an unceremonious thud. The final assailant didn't have enough time to reconsider his approach. His panicked look clearly indicated his troops hadn't expected these foreign young people to defend themselves. Aiden parried the man's sword stroke with his own, although the forward momentum nearly toppled him. He quickly stepped back to stabilize. Niwa saw an opportunity to strike. The gnome moved in and smashed the man's shin with her copper walking stick. Following a hideous splintering noise, the man shrieked and attempted to hop on his good leg. But Aiden struck again, and the man collapsed back against the slope, dropping his sword. Feeling invigorated, Niwa swung her doha again and clubbed the man in the knee. The generally non-violent gnome felt a rush as she held her own among her siblings for the first time. The sensation was scary, but incredibly satisfying. Before the man could scream again, Aiden slashed the man's neck. The man collapsed in a heap. Aiden was breathing heavily and surging with adrenaline. He looked to his sister, who appeared equally astonished at what had just happened. Neither could believe they'd so successfully defended themselves. They wondered if combat and surviving on their own was becoming second nature to them. Mitra looked at the angry human. He was smiling at the gnome. His hair was a mess, and blood was splattered across his face. He had just murdered another human right in front of her. He then smiled at her. Was he trying to reassure her with that smile, as though everything was going to be great now? She felt paralyzed. The sword the man had been carrying was of much better quality than the one Aiden had claimed from a hobgoblin at the pond. He tossed that pitted short sword off the path and down the mesa. As he was collecting his new weapon, a large predatory cat also descended the mesa, leaping clear over the human to touch down directly in front of Clyde. Chapter 30. Man and Beast. She felt the giant cat's hot breath on her face. They stared at each other in a strange standoff. Clyde's eyes held total concession. She had accepted her imminent death. Then, the beast relaxed her shoulders and began to sniff the Ticus. She leaned close to sniff Clyde's neck and chest. Clyde didn't move. The black spots on the cat's fur blurred as her dusty auburn body moved.
"Shelfie?"
said a voice from up the slope. Clyde thought she recognized that voice as the beast turned her head back in attention. A halfling, pointing at something further down the mesa, walked toward them. His thick braids were pulled back in a small ponytail, resting against his dungaree vest. He descended the rocks and brambles, his hairy feet bare.
Shelfie?
Ruccharieu mumbled what he assumed was a command. What language was this? He glanced at his siblings, but they were on guard against the large predator. The elf felt foolish and returned to vigilance. The beast, having noticed the pointing finger, sprang down the mesa. Nearby, one of the humans who'd attacked them, still with Clyde's dagger in his thigh, was trying to stand. The beast, in one quick and horrifying motion, picked the man up by his throat with her teeth. The man groaned, but the noise was squeezed right out of him. With a brief shake of her massive head, she flung the man down the mesa, then discarded a bloody chunk of his throat by Niwa's feet before trotting back to the halfling.
I didn't do anything, I swear.
Niwa called out with a nervous laugh. She never took her eyes off the predator. The large cat was sitting in the road now, studying Niwa as the barefoot halfling walked over and placed a hand on his animal companion.
"This is Shelfie. She and I saw the whole thing, the whole mess. Would you mind tossing that last goober over there? Down the gulch will be fine then. I suppose Silk Ray's finest will be coming on scene soon enough. Might as well lose the evidence, I say."
Ruccharieu thought the pleasant, easygoing tone the halfling took while requesting a body be disposed was uncouth. Then again, he'd murdered another only moments ago. The mage looked at his brother Aiden, who was squatting to lift the body by its underarms. Following his lead, Ruccharieu grabbed the lifeless man's ankles. Clyde dashed over to remove a small pouch secured beneath the dead man's belt. She stiffened when Shelfie walked up behind her. When she stepped back, so did the cat. She waited, unsure what to do next. Aiden and Ruccharieu rocked the carcass backwards, then launched it in a synchronized heave down the mesa. Another unceremonious thump, and the job was done. Aiden sheathed a man's sword, claiming it as his own.
"There's no fear in her, my boy,"
the halfling said to Clyde, smiling.
"She'll always protect the Ticus, especially the youngers."
Who are you?
Aiden asked indignantly. Why would this man refer to his sister as a boy? That put him off. The halfling's olive skin was sun-darkened and covered in streaks of dust and dirt. He said to Aiden,
"Once more, if you please."
I said, who are you?
As Aiden raised his voice, Mitra cowered once more.
"I'm Azaka,"
the halfling replied.
That's no boy, Azaka.
Aiden was agitated. He felt compelled to correct the man because he knew Clyde wouldn't have said anything. Ruccharieu noticed the halfling's eyes and thought he might be reading lips. He moved next to Aiden.
Hi, Azaka.
The elf said with a friendly wave.
I'm Rook, and this is my brother Aiden.
He tried to speak clearly without slowing down his speech so as not to seem condescending.
"Yeah, well met then."
Azaka's smile had faded, but his overall mellow temperament hadn't changed. Ruccharieu didn't wish to speak on his sibling's behalf, so he joined Clyde, standing with her in solidarity.
My name is Clyde.
The Ticus said.
I am their sister.
It felt surreal to introduce herself to the young man she thought she'd met in the woods at home, which she desperately wished to return to. She'd believed he was one of a handful of characters who were nothing more than hallucinations. Azaka smiled. Only Clyde had noticed Mitra who, after hearing sister, had stared at her in disbelieving bewilderment. Clyde openly stared back until Mitra caught herself and looked down.
I'm also their sister.
Niwa added.
I'm Niwa. Your cat is friendly too, right?
Ruccharieu cleared his throat and pointed at his elven ear. Niwa understood. The halfling was deaf. His speech was heavily accented, but clear. She stepped before him and repeated herself as though the first introduction had never happened.
You did fine work here too, young lady,
Azaka said.
Where be you all headed then?
A knot in Aiden's stomach begged him not to admit they weren't sure.
We couldn't let Mitra be sold into slavery. Do you know of an island far to the southeast where
He searched for the word.
mangrove trees grow?
The halfling's smile grew large. He studied the human's face, searching for insincerity.
We knew you all be friendly.
Azaka replied cryptically. He chuckled.
Can never be sure, of course. Had to watch the whole affair from above to be sure, but Shelfie and me, we knew.
On the next episode, it looks like the siblings may have finally met a friend in this strange new world. Leaving town only moments earlier, they are still pursued by slaver guards, a ranger, and his giant bobcat. Is anyone else following them?
What is it?
I thought I heard talking.
Just when they might need to defend themselves yet again, their new ally dashes away.
My poppets, y'all never saw me.
Wait, Poppets? Are you leaving? Why did you help us in the first place?
Nothing in this new world makes sense to them.
I have so many questions.
As the new voices grow closer, the siblings prepare for another encounter. Chapter 31, A Second Interview. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 6 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Jason Pagano as Ruccharieu, Daniel Neal as Azaka, Sarah Luz as Mitra, Lucian Opila as the Auctioneer, and James Stacy as Oxbow. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com and Pond5.